I want to welcome everyone to this second lecture, Understanding the Formal Elements of Human Creativity. The primary purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to the kinds of things that we look at, think about, and talk about, and write about in the areas of the humanities. Specifically, we're going to focus on the visual arts, the performing arts, and literature. And at the end of this lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the assignments that you'll have for experiencing the arts this semester. In talking about the visual arts, we're going to divide the visual arts into three major areas: two-dimensional art, art that has width and length or height to it, art that is contained within a frame or is flat, three-dimensional art, which we could also refer to as sculpture, and structural art, which is really, we're talking about architecture. Let's begin first with looking at two-dimensional art in the next slide. In looking at two-dimensional art, we're going to talk about four aspects: subject matter and theme, the approach that an artist takes in creating his or her work, composition, how the work is put together, and media, what the work is made out of and how it is made. Let's move on to the next slide. In talking about subject matter and theme, we're answering the question, what is this work of art about? Now, it could be about something from the sacred realm. What we mean by that is, could be something that depicts God or the gods, anything having to do with the supernatural, what is above human experience. Another subject matter is heroes and history. Heroes could be either from the stories and myths that different societies and cultures create, such as Hercules for the Greeks and the Romans, or Thor for the Scandinavians, or Ramayana in the Indian tradition. Or an artist could choose to depict figures from history. In American history, those would be things and people like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the Battle of Gettysburg, perhaps paintings or drawings that depict the western migration of European Americans from the eastern United States into the West, depictions of Native Americans and how life changed for them over time. A third area of subject matter is politics and society. Very often artists will use images to communicate messages about what is going on politically and socially. During the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, there was a lot of art created about the Vietnam War. During that same period of time, there were many photographs, there were many paintings and drawings and other types of two-dimensional art that had to do with the civil rights movement and the issues related to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, women's rights. Those kinds of things not only find their way into the news and into literature, they also find their way into depictions of art. The fourth area of subject matter, the natural world, that's anything that has to do with nature around us: trees, mountains, seascapes, the sky, those kinds of things. The fifth area, everyday life, has to do with pictures that depict just simple things from everyday life. There's one type of drawing or painting called a still life, which usually has just objects that you would find around your home: a bowl, a cup, a pitcher, pieces of fruit, flowers, or everyday life could also include art that depicts everyday people, not famous people, but people that are involved in just day-to-day kinds of activities. Finally, the last area of subject matter is human experience. Art that is designed to communicate emotions and ideas about things that all of us experience: birth, death, suffering and pain, joy and celebration, our uncertainties about the future. Any of those kinds of things would be classed under the subject matter of human experience. Now, themes in art have to do more with ideas rather than what the subject or the thing portrayed is. Themes would be ideas and feelings like democracy, justice, injustice, pain, any of those more abstract kinds of things, coming of age, the journey through life. All of those have to do with themes as opposed to subject matter. Let's move on to another way of looking at two-dimensional art. When we're talking about the approach that an artist takes in producing a piece of two-dimensional art, we're talking about, does the artist intend for what he or she depicts to be instantly recognizable as a person, a place, or a thing? If so, that is called a representational approach. In ancient art especially, but even still some in modern day art, if rather than representing a particular man, woman, building, area of land, instead the general idea of a human being, the general idea of an animal, the general idea of a structure, that is usually referred to more as stylized approach. Abstract approaches, what is on the canvas, what is portrayed in the work of art, may have bits and pieces that are recognizable, but they may be put together in ways that are not recognizable as one solid thing. An artist named Pablo Picasso is very famous for taking bits and pieces of people and structures and putting them all together in very odd-looking combinations. Another well-known, more modern artist named Dada was famous for taking things like watches and having them melt on his paintings so that they looked very, very odd. And sometimes abstract art doesn't depict anything in particular. Maybe it is just colors and brush strokes or spatters of paint or random shapes and those kinds of things. The fourth type of approach is sometimes referred to as hyper-representational. This is when an artist uses materials that are intended to present what he or she presents in such a realistic way that it almost tricks the viewer into thinking that it is real. In the case of paintings and drawings, paintings mostly, this would be painting something with such strict attention to detail that it looks more like a photograph than a painting. In sculpture, sometimes sculptors will produce figures of human beings that are so lifelike you think that they could actually begin to talk or take a breath and walk. That's hyper-representational. There's a French term, trompe-l'oeil, that refers to this, but mostly it's referred to as hyper-representational. Let's move on to the next slide. In talking about composition in two-dimensional art, we're talking about how is the work of art put together. And we talk about that in two different ways. We talk about elements of composition, and we talk about principles of composition. Elements of composition include things like line, shape, form, mass, space, and perspective, color, texture, light, tone, contrast, and shading. Now, rather than to go into detail about those things in this lecture, I'm going to point your attention to My Arts Lab. And on the course menu in My Arts Lab, on the left-hand side of the screen of the course page, you will find a link that says Student Resources. If you click on that link, another menu will open up that will show you there are tremendous resources that are not necessarily required for assignments, but are there for you to use in completing other assignments. There's information there about how to write about art. There's information there about conducting research for writing projects and other assignments. And there's one item on that menu under Student Resources called Discovering Art. If you click on that, it will open you up, and there is really an art course, an introduction to art course contained within My Arts Lab. And you can view there, one of the links at the top of the screen when it opens will say Elements. If you click on that, it will walk you through a lot of good detailed information about the elements that are on the slide in front of you. It will give you the opportunity either to read text or to play the audio. You'll see slides representing the different elements that are being discussed. There are also videos that you can click from the top-hand margin that will walk you through the process of how artists create art and use the elements to put things together. There are galleries within that Discovering Art course that you can click on to view literally several hundred works of art that illustrate what's being talked about. So I invite you to take a look at those things to get more information about these elements that you will need to talk about in your Experiencing Art assignments, and you can go to the Discovering Art to get the more detailed information about the kinds of things that you could put into your paper. Let's move on to look at the principles of art. Principles of composition have to do with things like unity and variety, balance, repetition and rhythm, scale and proportion, focus, emphasis, and subordination. And again, I'll point you toward the Discovering Art materials in my arts lab. I wanted to put this on the screen and a slide in this lecture to introduce you to the words and the ideas. We will be talking about some of these as we go through the course related to other works of art related to different societies and cultures, but we will not go into a lot of detail about it here. Let's move on to media. When we're talking about media with two-dimensional art, we're talking about the material that is used to create the work and the method that is used. So, for example, we could refer to one medium of two-dimensional art as drawing. Drawing has much to do with line and shape. Drawing tends to be a quicker process than painting or working with textiles or other forms of creating two-dimensional art. But there are many different materials that could be used for drawing. What we often refer to as pencil lead or graphite is one material, but you could also draw using charcoal or crayon, a wax crayon. And well-known artists use wax crayon. It's not just a medium of art for young children, but there are other forms of chalk and even wet mediums. Sometimes people will say that drawing is a dry medium as opposed to painting, which is a wet medium, but many artists use pen and ink to draw. They even will use ink and a brush or a type of paint and a brush to do drawing. So it has more to do with the method of composition, how the artist uses the material, and whether the focus is more on line and shape as opposed to color, which is what is typically more representative in various types of painting. Painting has more to do with, as I said, color, but also texture. An artist can paint in such a way and use a type of paint that leaves brush strokes to create a textured appearance to the painting. There are various kinds of painting medium that can be used: oil paints or acrylic paints, watercolor paints, and tempera, and other kinds of things. In the My Arts Lab material under Discovering Art, there's a lot more detailed information and examples and discussion about these different forms of media. Textiles is a type of two-dimensional art that uses fabric or thread or yarn rather than pens, inks, brushes, and so on, also to create either representational scenes or abstract patterns and that type of thing. Another type of two-dimensional art that is not included on this slide, but you should be aware of, is printmaking. In drawing and painting, you might make a drawing of exactly the same theme, the exact same subject matter, but those two drawings are going to be different in at least subtle, small ways. They could be very different from one another. In printmaking, the artist works on making a master. That could be by engraving something on a wood block, or by scratching into metal, or creating something on a silk screen using a chemical process. and then using that master to produce multiple identical images on some other material. Could be paper, could be wood, could be canvas, could be fabric, a t-shirt in the case of silk screening. But printmaking is just as capable of producing beautiful, very detailed images as are drawing and painting. Printmaking's been around for thousands of years. Some of the most famous pieces of art are actually prints. The last form of two-dimensional art is photography. Photography is a much more modern form of two-dimensional art. It involves chemical processes that combine light with certain chemicals combined in a solution to reproduce exact images on paper originally, but now with digital technology, we are able not only to produce images using digital technology, but to manipulate those images and change those images, to Photoshop things into what was not originally there in a scene, and to remove things that were in a scene or change the appearance of what is there. So these are all different forms of media when it comes to two-dimensional art. Let's go on to talk about three-dimensional art. Three-dimensional art, which we can also refer to as sculpture, also has areas of subject matter and theme, pretty much exactly the same types of subject matter and themes that we discussed with two-dimensional art. An artist who is a sculptor can also take a representational or a stylized or an abstract or even a hyper-representational approach. But with sculpture, because it is three-dimension, we need to think about how the artist has used dimensionality. Some sculpture is meant to be viewed from not just the front, but it can be viewed from the back, it can be viewed from either side, might be able to be viewed from above, even from below. Art that is sculpture that is meant to be viewed from all sides is referred to as full round or 360 dimension sculpture. Relief sculpture is a little bit different than that. Relief sculpture has a flat background. It is sculpture that is meant to be viewed from primarily the front, maybe the sides, but the back is flat and undeveloped. And the figures look like they're stepping out of that flat background or melting into the background and into the space where the viewer is. Unlike two-dimensional art where the image is entirely in its own space, not in the space occupied by the viewer, relief sculpture, which is what we're talking about, begins with a flat background and moves into or protrudes, sticks out into the space of the viewer. Some relief sculpture is not very far into the space. That's called low relief. High relief is when the sculpture comes out quite a ways, maybe several inches into the space of the viewer. A third type of dimensionality is linear dimensionality, and that is where the viewer is intended to begin at one point and follow the sculpture along to another point. If you have ever visited or seen pictures of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., that memorial is a piece of sculpture. It's not a structure, even though you walk through. It's a sculpture intended for the viewer to begin at one end of it and to walk along and to view the names of those who died in that war. But the surface is very highly polished so that while you are looking at the names, your own image is being reflected back to you, and there's a powerful kind of effect that happens there, especially for those who fought in that war, as they see themselves now and as they look at the names perhaps of people that they knew quite well. When we talk about composition in three-dimensional art, we're talking about exactly the same types of things, elements and principles. And again, I point your attention to the Discovering Art section of my Arts Lab. When we're talking about media in three-dimensional art, we're talking again about material and method. Material in three-dimensional art could include stone, wood, fabric, metal, clay. Many different types of materials are used in the production of sculptures. But the methods generally fall into one of three types of methods. The first is subtraction. In other words, creating a three-dimensional piece of art, a sculpture, by taking something away from the material. When an artist who is working with stone, for instance, chisels away, breaks away the stone, that is subtraction. They're taking away from the entire piece of stone to create the images. So, for example, Mount Rushmore is a huge example of subtraction method sculpture. The folks who worked on that, they drilled, they used explosives, they chiseled the images of those four presidents out of the mountain that makes up Mount Rushmore. If you whittle, you are using a type of subtraction method, carving, cutting away wood to create a figurine, a figure, or an image using wood. Construction is a different type of process. Construction, you are starting with material that is kind of rough or raw, unformed, and using your hands or perhaps tools and other kinds of things like nails or screws, you are building, putting together the raw materials to create the image. Rather than taking away, you're actually putting together something that didn't exist from raw material. Excuse me. Another type of method is the substitution or replacement method. This is most used when statues or other forms of sculpture are used with molten metal poured into molds that have been created out of softer materials, often wax or clay. And as the molten metal cools around the mold, the softer material is burned away, melted away, and the metal takes on the shape of the mold. That's what we mean by a substitution method of making three-dimensional art. Finally, in three-dimensional art, some forms of three-dimensional art include motion. I have seen a commercial recently in which a huge piece of sculpture in a public setting, a great big block or cube of stone, is balanced absolutely perfectly so that the viewers are meant not just to view it, but they can actually move it, push it gently, and the whole sculpture rotates, moves around, changes its appearance. That was built in on purpose by the artist. Some artists construct three-dimensional pieces that hang and are meant to be moved by the air. We often refer to them as mobiles, which implies the motion. So that is an element of three-dimensional art that is not included in two-dimensional art. Let's move on now to begin talking about structural art. In talking about structural art or architecture, the first thing we begin talking about or thinking about is what is the purpose of the structure? Is it a religious structure? Is it intended to be a temple? Is it intended to be a church or a synagogue or a mosque or some other type of religious structure? If you are familiar with the site in England called Stonehenge, we'll be talking about that next week. You'll see pictures of it both in the textbook and in my arts lab. You'll notice that Stonehenge is not a structure in the way that we typically think of it. It doesn't have a roof, or at least it doesn't have a roof left. It's a circle that includes stones and pillars, posts, and lintels and things like that. But it has obviously been arranged to be included in some form of religious ceremony. Civic purposes would be, for example, Washington, D.C. is filled with fantastic architecture that is designed for civic purposes. Our government occupies the nation's capital, even the memorials that are in Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington or Jefferson memorials. Those are structures because you go into them and they are enclosed, but they are civic. They are meant to either house government or to point the viewer, point the folks who visit them to ideas that have to do with how our society is organized, our history, our shared stories, and so forth. If you are a student at South Central Kentucky Community and Technical College, there are civic structures in Bowling Green. For example, the Justice Center down on Central Avenue, or the Chamber of Commerce building down by the stadium. Even the stadium itself, any stadium, is a type of civic architecture, civic structural art, designed for a public purpose. Industrial and commercial is more a development of the modern age, but more and more factories, office buildings, stores are being designed not just for the function of housing whatever happens there, whether that's office work or manufacturing or commercial buying and selling, but the building itself is designed to be appreciated and enjoyed as a building. But its purpose is more, as I say, industrial commercial. When we're talking about private purposes, primarily we're talking about living space, homes either for one family or for multiple families, but also a type of private function architecture would be burial sites, graves. So, for example, when we talk about things like the pyramids of Egypt, are those religious functions? Are those private function burial? Are they civic to celebrate the greatness of a particular king of Egypt or a pharaoh? And the answer is probably some part of all three of those. But the very first place that we start in talking about structural art is what is or was the purpose that it serves or served in the society. Let's move on to the next slide. Because structural art is built in a setting and for a particular purpose, we also have to think about the climate and the setting, the geographical setting where the building or the structure is or was built. And so we think about things like climate. Is the structure in a place that has a lot of very hot, warm, dry weather? Is it in a place that has a lot of wet, cold weather? Because that leads to choices about building materials, how something is constructed. Is it a more open style? Is it enclosed because of the elements? Topography has to do with the kind of ground that something is built on. Is it built on a hillside? And did the design incorporate the hillside into how it was constructed? Is it built in an area where there's a lot of swamp and wetlands so that the construction had to take that into account so that the structure wouldn't settle or even sink? Is it built in an area where perhaps there are earthquakes or lots of storms and those kinds of things? All of that goes into the kind of topography. Finally, is the structure in an urban setting, in a city, or is it out in a rural area where there's less population? All of those things go into considerations of how a structure is designed, conceived, and then how it's built and what it is constructed of. Let's move on to the next slide. Obviously, structures and buildings are built out of something, and so we take into account and talk about the materials from which something is constructed. And there are both natural materials, things like stone and wood, mud, which is formed into bricks, and there are manufactured materials, things like iron, steel, concrete, and cement, and even bricks, which take certain types of things from the soil and turn them into building materials. I talked about mud as a natural building material, but then it is fashioned, combined with straw and dried to make mud bricks. Is that a natural material? Is it a manufactured material? And the answer again is probably both in some form. Different building materials have advantages and disadvantages to them in terms of being easy to find or produce, standing up to the elements, lasting for a long time, and ease of use, and even the types of structures that you can make out of certain materials leads to decisions about what kind of buildings you make based on what's available to you. So that is why thinking about materials is so important. Let's move on. Whenever we talk about structural art or architecture, one of the main considerations that designers and builders of all ages have to take into consideration is how the structure will stand. In other words, how what is produced will work with the forces such as gravity and other natural forces to remain upright and to resist the forces of gravity from the weight of the building materials that are being used. We're going to look at 5 structural systems, as they're referred to. The first of which is post and lintel construction. Post and lintel has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It is evident in some of the earliest examples of structure that we have from the ancient Near East, as well as even from late Stone Age period. Post and lintel refers to a horizontal block of stone that is laid over top of upright or vertical supporting posts of stone. Now, post and lintel works with 2 different types of strength that is referred to in building material. Tensile strength has to do with the strength that a building material has to withstand bending. Now, stone as a building material has a great deal of compression strength. Compression strength or compressive strength means if you have a block of stone, it will resist forces trying to crush it or exerting force upon it. Stone is very strong that way. But stone, because of its weight, you can't have a long, unsupported block of stone that is very large because the weight and gravity pulling down will tend to make it break and crack in the middle. Therefore, post and lintel construction was used by putting upright posts in between shorter pieces of stone that allowed the construction to be built on top of that. It would support a great deal of strength, but also give the stone enough support that it wouldn't crack in the middle. Another way of addressing some of these same kinds of issues was the development of the arch. And as we go through the course this semester, we'll talk about the development of the arch from different cultures and different periods of history, how it began, how it developed, how it was borrowed and further developed by different cultures. What happens with an arch is that the forces pushing down on the arch construction allows those forces to be, and that energy to go from the middle of the arch and to be transferred to the sides of the arch. And so the energy actually goes down around the sides and down into the ground. And it allows for much more weight to be placed on top of the archway than, say, the post and lintel construction as well. A cantilever is a different way of addressing some of these issues. Cantilever building construction has a horizontal beam or block that extends out beyond where the supports are. The supports only go, they'll start on one side, go into the middle, but a part of the over or the on top beam and arch extend and stick out over top of it. As we get further along into the semester, we'll see a number of examples. There are examples of this in your textbook that I'll point your attention to as we go through. A bearing wall system of construction is when a wall itself is built of strong enough material that it bears the weight of the structure itself. There aren't any frames inside of it. There's no structure inside of it supporting the weight. The wall itself, as it is constructed out of stone or out of concrete or whatever, is a solid material wall, and it is bearing the weight of the structure itself. Now, a skeleton frame is what we are probably most familiar with in our context in 21st century America. Much of the construction that happens in our society has to do with skeleton frame, either using metal, steel, beams and girders and those type of things. For instance, in high-rise buildings, skyscrapers, that's called a steel cage type of skeleton frame. The structure, the weight is supported on the structure, the frame itself, and then the other building materials are attached to the frame, but they do not, in fact, bear the weight. The plaster, the wallboard, and those kinds of things, whatever is used, do not bear the weight of the structure. Now, balloon style or balloon type construction is what we're probably most familiar with. That's a common type of construction that's used in home building, where the frame, rather than being made out of metal, as in a skyscraper, is made out of wood 2x4s. Maybe there's been a concrete pad or foundation laid, and then the wood is attached to that, and the wood frames, the 2x4s, the 2x6s, or whatever, bear the weight of the structure, and then other materials are used to create the walls in and around the structure. So those are what we mean by structural system. And when you will be looking at architecture, when you will be talking about it and writing about it for your assignments, you will need to understand the type of structural system that's being used in the structure that you're reviewing. Let's move on. As in both two-dimensional art and three-dimensional art, we can use the same kinds of terminologies, at least in principle, principles of composition, in talking about composition, how a building is put together. Architecture uses the same types of principles of unity and variety and balance and symmetry and all those kinds of things that are talked about in my arts lab and in your textbook to describe the structure and appearance of architectural art. So we'll not go into a lot more detail about that. Instead, we're going to transition now from talking about the visual arts into talking about the performing arts. In looking at the performing arts, we're going to look at 5 basic areas: music, dance, theater, opera, and cinema, or film and video comprises cinema. Opera is a type of performance art that combines music, dance, and theater all together. And so we'll talk about all 5 of these. Let's move on. In talking about music, one of the first things we think about, talk about, and you will want to make sure you identify in your experiencing arts project, what is the instrumentation? What is making the music? What is producing the sound? Is it a human voice or human voices? Is it a string instrument? String instruments would be things like violins or cellos or string basses. Guitar even could be considered as a string instrument or a percussion instrument. Depends really on who you are talking about. They'll classify it as either or. Wind and brass instruments, anything that you blow air into and passes over to produce a sound, either the vibration of the sound in a brass or metal instrument like a trumpet or trombone or a tuba or baritone or anything like that, or a wind instrument. Woodwinds typically are things like clarinets and saxophones, oboes, where a reed is used, a thin piece of wood, and as the musician blows air across the piece of wood or the reed, its vibration produces a sound that is then amplified by the instrument. And by placing your fingers and changing the position of your fingers, it raises or lowers the sound. Percussion instruments, the most common, obvious percussion instruments are things like drums, cymbals, but guitars can also be thought of as a percussion instrument because you are plucking the string. What's actually happening is you're striking or pulling the string, and that's producing the vibration. Interestingly enough, pianos are considered to be more percussion than string instruments because as you're playing a piano, what you push down the key and the mechanism of a piano, there's a little hammer inside, and the hammer is actually hitting the strings, and that's what produces the sound. It strikes the strings, and percussion instruments are instruments that produce sound by something striking something, and that's why pianos are considered to be a percussion instrument. Then there is electronic music. Some forms of electronic music would include more common forms of modern organs. Old style organs, I mean the really old style organs that have been around for hundreds of years, were originally wind instruments, because what happened was, as someone was pumping the organ mechanism, that produced air that passed through the organ. The person sitting at the keyboard played the keys that changed how the air moved through an organ, and they came out great big huge pipes, and that's where the sound came from. Now, with the advent of electricity, eventually strictly wind-produced organs began to be merged with electronic mechanisms to produce the air. So you had blending of electronic and pipes that produced the sound. And then later on, there were organs. Most organs that are in smaller churches are strictly electronic devices. The electronics produce the instrument. Now there are all kinds of electronic instruments that produce music of various sorts. Electronic keyboards. There are guitars that, of course, are amplified. And the mixing of computer-generated music, it's a whole different type of field now. But these are the different types of musical instrumentation. When you write about your music performance, you'll need to make sure that you identify the instrumentation behind it. Let's move on to the next area. When we talk about music as a performance art, we want to think also about the different forms of music. What was often referred to as classical music could also be called performance music. And the reason that I make that distinction is that within what most people refer to when they think of classical music, for instance, that might go back to the 15 and 1600s, the 1700s into the 1800s, in music appreciation and music history classes, though all of that music that generally we refer to as classical music is broken down into historical periods, each of which is given a particular name. For example, there is Renaissance and medieval music, which comes from the 1400s and the 1500s and even earlier. Baroque music, B-A-R-O-Q-U-E, Baroque music, is music that comes from the late 1500s into the 1600s, early 1700s. It has a very different style and sound to what music teachers, music historians refer to as classical music, which comes from primarily the early 1700s through about the middle part of the 1800s. Romantic music picks up with the late 1700s into the mid to late 1800s. And then there is more modern form of performance music. But as I said, most of us, if we were to hear this kind of music, a symphony or a concerto or a sonata, those types of music, would call that classical music. A symphony uses the entire instruments, all of the instruments of an orchestra. A concerto is typically just a few instruments playing together, one main instrument playing with perhaps the orchestra in the background. A sonata, which literally means a sounding piece, is usually a type of music that one instrument plays by itself. Maybe it is accompanied by another music. But that type of music, classical music, performance music, is one type. That is very different from the form of music that is one of the types of music that is especially American in form, and that is jazz. Jazz is a form of music that developed in the middle to late 1800s, especially the early 20th century, the 1900s. And jazz is a type of music that uses improvisation more. Improvisation means if there's not a written score of music, there's not written music in front of you, and instead the musician plays based on their ear or based on what they think would be next, and the people in a group or an ensemble play together with them. Jazz forms tend to be very loose and free and use a lot of improvisation, people making it up as they go along. The instrumentations can vary from piano and saxophone. Sometimes banjos are used in jazz forms of music as well. A development off of jazz are what a lot of us listen to on the radio. Rock and roll, rock and later pop music that developed as a blend from jazz. It developed out of the blues music, a lot of African American influences on the early development of rock and roll in the late 1940s, early 1950s. People like Elvis Presley and that generation were very much in the beginning of developing what rock and roll sounded like, how it was formed, how it was written, how it was performed, and those type of things. A form of music that has developed in the last 20, 25 years, probably going back into the early mid-1980s and continuing forward, is rap. Rap is a very different form of music in that it may or may not include musical instruments. It is largely focused on the human voice and the use of rhythms and rhymes and repetition. It's often made up on the spot, but it's a very different and distinctly American form of music developed in the urban areas among especially African American communities, but now has spread around. Finally, world music. World music encompasses musical forms that come from all different cultures, all different societies. Much of our understanding, and when you study music in classes like this, the tendency is to only focus on music that developed in Western Europe and America. But world music is a wealth of music that comes from Asia, that comes from Latin America, that comes from all over the world. It may come not only from civilized societies, but from tribal societies using what we would think of as very primitive kinds of music. Very different kinds of blending of rhythms and melodies and all of those kinds of things. So those are the 5 kinds of musical forms that as you work on your assignments this semester, you'll need to be aware of and to identify whatever you're listening to, what type of forms of music it is. Let's move on. When we begin to analyze music, think about music, write about it for courses like this. Of course, sound is the most obvious characteristic of music. Now, reminding all of us that this is not a music appreciation class, this is not a music history class. When we're talking about music and sound, these 4 basic elements are what we're going to focus on. Pitch has to do with the relative highness or lowness of the sounds. There is all kinds of detailed information that you could go into if you are a musician or have a musical background. You understand about the musical scale. You understand that there are 2 different clefs, a treble clef and a bass clef. I am not going to ask that you go into that level of detail for this class. But if you can talk about that the type of music that you were listening to or individual pieces that you were listening to were higher sounding or lower sounding or a blend of those, that's perfectly fine. Tone has to do with the quality of the sound. Now, if without using recordings in this lecture, if you can think about the way that a trumpet sounds and the way that a flute sounds and the way that a piano sounds and the way that a violin sounds. Now, if you took all 4 of those instruments and you had them play exactly the same note on the musical scale, the pitch would be the same, but what would be different would be the tone. A piano's sound is very different in quality. It can be mellow. It can be harsh or strong. A trumpet has a more metallic sound to it than, say, a flute, which has a very soft kind of a tone to it. A guitar, depending upon is it an electric guitar or an acoustic guitar, the tone of it can be softer, it can be harder. All of that goes toward tone. Dynamics, we're talking about loudness and softness. Is it something that is very soft and flowing? Is it something instead that is very loud and dynamic? That's where the tone comes from. So highness and lowness is pitch. Softness, hardness, metallic sounding, quality of sound, that's tone. Loudness and quietness or softness of sound, dynamics. Duration has to do with, are the notes that are being played long and held out, or are they short and just that type of thing? Or are the tones much longer? And does the music seem to flow, or does it seem to be choppy? That's what I'm referring to as duration. So those are the four elements of sound that for the purposes of this course at least, you should be familiar with. Let's move on. The next element that we talk about in relation to music is rhythm, and I'm going to take these three parts of rhythm out of order. I'm going to deal with the first one, or the second one first, beat. Obviously, if you are even just a casual listener to music, you are aware that music can have a very obvious beat to it. Sometimes if you're listening to rock or rap, the beat is very heavy. A bass guitar is just thumping away on the beat at the beginning of every measure, or every so often in the music. You can just hear the bass pounding away. Or a drum set. If you are a drummer, or you listen to a lot of music that uses drums, typically there's a bass drum either in an orchestra or on a drum kit for a band. You'll hear the beat thumping away as well, in combination with. The beat is what sets the music in periods of music, which are referred to as measures. If you're a musician, you're familiar with that term. And the first beat in a measure of whatever way the music is written, which brings us to meter. If you are a musician, if you read music, you are familiar with what meter is. Music is written in meters that are either 3/4 or 3/4 music, or 4/4 time, or 6/8 time. Meter refers to the number of beats that are in a measure of written music. Meter, when we refer to 3/4 time or 4/4 time, that is the number of beats in a measure of written music, as I said, and what type of note receives what amount of beat in it. That's really all the detail I need to go into for the course for the sake of this course. But simply as a casual listener, if you're not a musician, as you're listening to music, try counting and see what seems to be the most natural way of counting for the music. Can you count as you're listening to the music? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. If so, the music is probably 4/4 time. If instead you're listening to something and you can count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, it's probably in 3/4 time. Every so often, though, you'll encounter a piece of music that neither one of those seems to work really well. Try counting 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. If that's the case, now this is going to sound odd, I know, but the chances are the piece is written in what is called 6/8 time, which is usually counted either in 2 beats to a measure or 3 beats to a measure. Again, if you're not a musician, don't get yourself all tangled up in detail about this, but try the counting to become accustomed to thinking and hearing about music in terms of the beat. Tempo has to do with how fast or how slow. Does it stay the same? Does it speed up? What effect does the change in tempo make as you're listening to a piece of music? Also, as you're listening to music and you're counting, you may be counting and you can hear that 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then all of a sudden in the middle of the music it changes and it starts being 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's something that a composer chooses to do for a reason. You might want to think about what that reason is. Anyway, that's all about rhythm as far as we're going to be concerned about it for this class. Let's move on. The last two elements that we're talking about in terms of music have to do with melody and harmony. If you're a musician, you already understand these terms. You really don't need me to explain them to you. Melody, for those of you who are not musician, is what you think of as the main tune of a song. Happy birthday. Da 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 da. That's a simple melody for that song. But if there are other notes, if there are other sounds that are produced other than the main tune, what you can identify as the main tune, that's the harmony part. As composers write music, there are other notes put together in what are called chords of particular arrangements and numbers of notes on the musical scale that produce a richer, a fuller sound. Sometimes composers will choose to have only a naked melody, one note playing at a time. But a lot of the time, music will carry harmony with it. Sometimes the harmony will be very easy and to listen to and very smooth. Sometimes it will be kind of jarring to us. So as you're thinking and writing about the music, describe the relationship of the melody and the harmony. Think about all of the sounds that are in there and try to characterize those. Let's move on. In moving from talking about music to talking about theater, again, we're going to think about and ask you to pay attention to 4 elements if you attend a theatrical production, a play. And those are function, script, staging, sound, and action. Obviously, I can't count. There are actually 5 elements there. The first function, theater or plays can play different roles within a society. Sometimes theater is strictly for entertainment, but there are times when theater productions are religious in content as well, or political in content, civic, in other words. So much like architecture can have different functions within a society, so can theatrical productions. In fact, theater, as we understand it, at least in Western civilization, emerged from classical Greek civilization. We're going to be looking at that in week 3. And it was originally part of religious ceremonies that were being held. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. Now, besides function, script is another feature of theater. And script is, obviously, the written words that actors speak, but also directions of how they are to act, what they are to do. And script, in terms of theater, is the equivalent when we get to talking about drama in literature. They correspond to one another. Drama has more to do with the way the script is written in terms of the way the story is developed, the way the characters are developed, and so on. Script includes that, but is more to do with how the action actually happens on stage. Which brings us to staging. There are many different ways of staging a play. There are different types of theaters. Some theaters have the audience sitting all the way around the stage on all sides. That's called theater in the round. Most theaters that we're used to thinking about, the audience sits in front and the stage is kind of elevated and there is scenery in the background and the stage actually sticks out into the audience a little bit. That's a fancy term called a proscenium type of stage. Some plays are staged with different stages located in different parts of the theater. Maybe there's some action taking place over here on the left and some action taking place on the right, some in front of us. There might even be some stuff happening out behind us. Those are all choices that a writer makes in writing the script. They are also choices that a director makes in how it's actually staged in the theater. Other aspects of staging include costume, Some plays use just regular, everyday street clothes. They're written for a contemporary scene, a contemporary audience, so the actors are dressed in pretty much exactly the same way the audience is dressed. But since some plays depict things that happened in the past, they may use costumes from that period of history. If they're written about things maybe in an imagined future, they use clothing that might be very different from what the audience is wearing. Costume plays a very important role in creating the illusion of what's taking place on the scene. For instance, if you would go to Broadway in New York City and to watch a play, you might watch a play like Cats, if you've heard of that or are familiar, where all of the characters in the play are meant to be cats, and so they're dressed, their costumes make them look like cats, as opposed to the Lion King, which is still playing on Broadway. Many of those, all of those characters their costumes present them as different animals of the jungle or the savannah, actually, of Africa. If you have seen the stage play Les Miserables or you saw the movie, those costumes are meant to convince the audience that the story is taking place in the middle of the 1800s in France. And so costume can be used to create the illusion or to shape the audience's understanding of what's going on with the story. The same is true of scenery. Scenery has to do with the background, with the props or the things, the objects that are used on stage, furniture. Sometimes the scenery is on painted scenery on the background. Sometimes it's a set that is constructed out of wood and fabric and to create of where the story is taking place. Very important in theater is sound. Most theater historically has not had the advantages of modern technology for amplifying. So microphones weren't used, speakers weren't used. So theaters had to be constructed in ways that would allow sound to travel from what was being performed on the stage to where the audience was seated. Speaking of sound, I'm recording this lecture actually at a location where there are a fair amount of small children around. So every so often you may hear children in the background. That's just the way things are. Anyway, sound is very important for the audience to be able to hear the words that are being spoken by the actors in order to follow the story. And so while we often think of theaters as being indoor, much early theater was actually performed outdoors. The earliest theater that was produced by the Greeks took place in large outdoor theaters that were built into hillsides often. And some of those theaters were they were all outdoors, but some of those could seat 10,000 people or more. They were almost more like stadiums than what we think of as theaters. And so they had to think about how to project the sound. And they would do that in the construction of the theater. The theaters tended to be constructed so that sound would move up and out from the stage and travel upward and outward and be along the stone seats or the wood seats sometimes. But even how the actors, their costumes, in Greek theater, they wore masks. And inside the masks, the mouthpieces were like mini megaphones. They were shaped in such a way that as the actor spoke his lines, all the actors were male in Greek theater, the mask itself acted as kind of a non-electronic way of amplifying and sending the sound out. The last area has to do with action. In theater, action can be portrayed in literal terms. The actors literally carry out the actions that the script implies. But some forms of theater, there's very little of what we would refer to as action. The action is instead suggested. It can be very subtle rather than if two people are engaged in a sword fight. Some forms of theater, They only talk about being involved in a sword fight. They're not actually doing the motions themselves. Some forms of theater, it's exactly the opposite. Everything is communicated through action and there are no words. So there are lots of different ways in which these five, I've got the right number now, five elements interact with each other to produce theater. But as you're viewing your arts experiences and writing about them then for this course, you need to take into consideration the blend of these five elements. Let's move on. When we're talking about opera, immediately the word might put people off. Whenever many students hear the word opera, the immediate picture that comes to many students' minds is a large woman dressed in a helmet with horns sticking out, singing in a high voice in a foreign language that they can't understand. Much of opera in Western civilization over the last several centuries has come from Europe, from places like Italy and France and Germany. Opera is a type of theater in which all of the language is in music. All of it is sung rather than spoken. That is the definition of opera. Now, in looking at opera, you want to take a look at the, first of all, musical form. Because while most opera that we're familiar with is what we would refer to in classical musical forms, there is opera, there are operas that were written in rock and roll forms. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, the musical group The Who produced a rock and roll opera called Tommy, and that was produced on the stage for many, many years. A movie was made out of it. Elton John was the main actor one of the main actors in that movie, and that's a rock and roll opera, Jesus Christ Superstar. If you're familiar with that name, at least, maybe you've seen it. Jesus Christ Superstar was a rock opera that was produced on Broadway. Probably the most familiar one of recent years is Les Miserables. Les Miserables is an opera in everything is sung on stage, and in the movie that was produced last year, everything was sung by all of the actors in the film. So you want to pay attention. There are even rap operas out there, I understand. I've not heard one, but there are some that are out there. So opera doesn't just mean classical music. You want to think about the musical form. You'll also think about staging, costume, and scenery, and action, which we've already talked about, and also subject and theme. We didn't talk about this in terms of theater, but thinking about subject and theme is just as much part of thinking about theater and opera as it is in talking about the visual arts. So that would be something that you would want to take into consideration as well. Let's move on. Probably the form of performing art that most of us most frequently have advantage of is cinema. Going to the movies. People go to the movies all the time, or watching things on television. Cinema is a form of performance art that blends together theater, but because it has the capabilities of technology, the presentation of the story can be done in some ways that live theater can't be done. Now, when you're talking about cinema, like with theater, you begin with talking about a script, the writing, the words that actors are saying, the way that it's written, the quality of it. Does it make sense? You also talk about staging. Where does the story take place? What does the set look like? Is it everything taking place indoors on just one specific set? If you've ever watched the television show Seinfeld, much of that television show was shot with Jerry's apartment or the coffee shop, or there were a few other places, but most of that show took place in one of those two locations. Or does it use a lot of outdoor city sets and those type of things? Again, how the action is presented. Some films are almost all action. Some films have very little in the way of action. They are more conversational, the interactions between people. The story has to do not with solving a mystery or preventing aliens from taking over the world or blowing things up, but they have to do with the complexity of human relationships, the way that men and women relate to one another, friendship, and how that is tested and supported. All those kinds of things. Obviously, cinema, you're going to be looking at the use of costume as well. Lighting and sound play an even more important role in movies and television because the images are being captured by cameras, either film camera or television video or digital even. And so the use of lighting and the manipulation of lighting and sound after the scene has been shot, after it goes back into an editing room, and editing is the last part of what we talk about. How is the lighting and sound changed, manipulated to create certain images on the screen? Along with that goes camera technique. There are ways of shooting a movie. You could do everything in black and white. For many, many years, that's the only way it was done. They didn't have the capability of making color movies. That didn't happen until the 1930s, 1940s. But even today, some filmmakers make a conscious choice to only use black and white and not to make color films. Why do they make that choice? What does that gain them in terms of the sharpness of the image, and how does that contribute to the story? But other things with camera technique have to do with, are they using one camera or two? Do you see everything from one angle? Or does the scene shift from one camera angle to another camera angle? Does the camera itself move and follow the action? Does the camera stay stationary and straight? Does it tilt? Some movies, especially in recent years, have been tilted, and the camera, it feels like it's being jerked around, moved around. That's being done on purpose. That's not accidental. A director is making a choice. How does that contribute to the overall experience of the film? Why do you think a director made those kinds of choices? Sometimes directors will make a choice to slowly fade out of a scene and slowly fade into a next scene, or there's almost no transition at all, and it's very rapid, and from flash one scene to another scene to another scene, or from one camera angle to another. All of those represent choices that directors make, and you should think about why those choices are. How do they impact your experience of the film that you're watching? Let's move on. As we said in Lecture 1, when we briefly introduced literature as one of the areas of the humanities, literature, as we're going to talk about it in this course, breaks down into three major types, categories, or genres. G-E-N-R-E, it's a French word that means family or class, of literature: poetry, drama, and fiction. Let's first talk about poetry. In talking about poetry, again, there are five things that we look at, the first of which is form. There are different types of poems. Epic poetry is poetry that is typically very long. It is poetry that tells a story, and it is poetry that is often set either in mythology, in other words, the stories of the gods and goddesses, or the great heroes of the past. It was poetry that was originally created, composed, and then transmitted from one poet to another over generations, not by writing, but by oral composition and repetition, and eventually came to be written down. We'll be talking a lot more about epic poetry, in fact, looking at some examples of epic poetry next week, in week 2, when we begin talking about the cultures of the ancient Near East and some of their stories and myth. Lyric poetry is poetry that tends to be very short and very personal, especially. Usually the poet, the narrator, the person who is speaking, is talking about very personal kinds of experiences thoughts and feelings, those kinds of things. Those are probably the two basic types of style of poetry, the difference between epic poetry and lyric poetry. In terms of sound, poetry is a use of language that doesn't just convey meaning, in other words, the meaning of the words, but the words are arranged in such a way that the sounds of the words themselves can be part of the overall enjoyment and experience of poetry. Poetry, most poetry, was and is meant to be read aloud, so that the sound of the words have a chance to have an effect on the reader, on the hearer. And so a poet might choose to combine lots of the same type of letter or same sounds in words, maybe lots of S's, lots of R's, lots of E's, the use of sound that way. Related to sound is the use of rhythm. Poetry, we're most familiar, probably most of us, with poetry that uses rhyme. And rhyme is a special part of sound. Rhyme is poetry, of course, or when the same sound ends lines, or two words sound alike at the end of a line or of a group of poetry words. But rhythm has to do with the combination of how the syllables of words work. Now, if you're not familiar with syllable, all words in our English language and in most other languages as well can be broken down into parts within a word. Those parts are called syllables. So, for instance, I'm just picking words out of thin air, out of my head. So, for instance, Washington. Our word Washington, either the name of a person or the name of a city, has 3 syllables. Washington. And the syllables are distinct parts of that word. What poets do when they're writing poetry is they might write a line of poetry that has the same number of syllables in every line in that poem. And the combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. Example, our word Washington. The first syllable, the wa, is where we put more emphasis. We don't say Washington or Washington. We say Washington. So the stress is put on that first syllable. Well, poets use the combination of how many syllables there are in words and where the stress is put on those words in syllables, and they arrange their poets. They write poems so that there's the same number of syllables in lines and the stress is at the same point. And part of the art of writing some forms of poetry is making poems that make sense in terms of what they're saying, but using words that have the same rhythm to them with the same arrangement of syllables. And so that's part of what some forms of poetry are about. Other forms of poetry, especially more modern forms of poetry, don't pay any attention to that stuff at all. And instead they use other ways of organizing the poetry. So poetry uses sound and rhythm. It also uses imagery and symbolism. The language of the poem may refer and make the reader think of not just what the words on the page say, but they create mind pictures, word pictures for the reader. And as we talk about particular forms of poetry as we go along in the course, we'll talk a little bit more about that. If you really want to become more familiar with this, I invite you to take an Introduction to Literature course. You'll learn a lot about poetry as well as the other forms of literature. Like other forms of visual arts, poetry will also deal with subjects and themes. And again, as the course progresses, we'll unpack some of that and how that works from society to society. Let's move on. When we were talking about theater, I told you about the script and the relationship of script to drama. Well, now we're going to talk about drama. Drama has to do with the ideas of the story that's being presented in the play. And so when we talk about drama, first of all, there are different forms of drama. There's tragedy and comedy. Tragedy tends to be what we think of as serious, but tragedy, the classical definition of tragedy is that a hero, the main character, undergoes a change from good circumstances to difficult circumstances, that there is suffering that takes place, and that maybe the main character or the hero learns something or doesn't learn something, but the audience learns something from observing what the main character, the hero or heroes, go through during the course of the play. Comedy, on the other hand, tends to be exactly the opposite. Comedy begins with difficult circumstances, a conflict, a problem that moves then to being resolved, to a happier outcome, you might think of it. We tend to think of comedy as being about what makes you laugh. There's elements of that in comedy, but really comedy has more to do with starting off with a problem and it going to a happy outcome, a good outcome. There are some forms of current drama that blend those two together. Tragicomedy are stories that are presented where are there funny parts of it? Yes, and there's a lot of laughter in it, but there are serious things that happen in it as well, and the ending may or may not be happy at the outcome. Melodrama is a type of drama that developed especially during the 1800s in England and the United States and other European nations. Melodrama is just serious, packed on serious, sadness on sadness and suffering and all the rest, that you just kind of go, oh, really? Could it possibly get any worse? Almost to a ridiculous degree. And so that's what the typical form of melodrama means. Let's move on. The second element of drama is the plot, and the plot is what happens in the story. And there are some different parts that have to do with plot. There's action, the action of the people in the story. How is it presented? Action typically begins with a conflict. The main character in a drama, the hero, has a problem that needs to be resolved. And so action in drama might start off kind of at a low level. You learn what the background information is in the story, and then the action rises as the conflict, the problem, becomes more serious and more serious, and it gets to a point where something's got to happen. That's called the climax point. Something's got to happen if the problem is going to be resolved or not. And you get to the point of conflict being resolved at the climax, and then the action, it's called falling action after that, where kind of loose ends and things are tied up. Also, within the plot of a story, it's not just action and not just the resolution of conflict, but there might be symbolism or symbols that are used. Visual images or ideas or words that are talked about that the audience understand have a deeper, fuller meaning than just what is talked about in the story itself. For example, if you were watching a play that is set in early American history, and there's a lot of talk about eagles, or visual images of eagles. Well, obviously, the eagle is something that has a great deal of symbolism in American life. It is one of our national symbols because of the fierce pride that eagles, we tend to think of independence and freedom. All those things are important to us as Americans. And so the use of those kinds of visual images or verbal references in drama often carry a deeper meaning. And so you listen for those, you watch for those as they're presented in the drama. Irony Irony is when someone says something that they think means one thing, but the audience recognizes means something completely different that maybe the character doesn't realize. There's irony is used quite a bit, especially in ancient Greek tragedy. One of the most famous plays in the history of theater, in classical Greek drama, Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex. The entire play is about a man who is good at figuring out riddles, figuring out problems, and there is a curse upon the city in which he is a king, and he has to try to figure out what's behind the curse. And as you go through the play and as you watch the play, he says things about untangling problems and finding the solution. And once he finds the solution, whoever is guilty has to be punished by, being kicked out of the city. And what the audience comes to understand before the main character does is he's the one. He's the one guilty of the crime. But he doesn't realize that. The audience figures it out fairly early on, and actually, the audience that would have viewed the play in those days already knew the story. But as the main character says stuff on stage, the audience is going, "Oh, I can't believe, oh, don't you see what you're doing? Oh." And so it's that sense of irony that is often used in drama. So as you're thinking about the plot, you want to think about, is irony being used anywhere? What is ironic about what's taking place on the stage? Let's move on. The third area that we look at for drama is character. And the two terms that you should be most familiar with regarding character is protagonist and antagonist. The protagonist in a drama is the person who has the problem, the person who has to try to figure something out, who has to solve a difficulty or change from one thing to another thing. The antagonist is the person or persons who are preventing the protagonist from solving his or her problem, experiencing what they are trying to experience or whatever. And the conflict is the attempts of the protagonist to solve his or her problem and the antagonist preventing him or her from doing that. Sometimes the antagonist can be another person. Sometimes the antagonist can be the same person. If the story is about someone who is trying to change or become a better person and yet they keep doing the same things over and over and over again, that type of story, the main character is both the hero, the protagonist, and the antagonist. Sometimes nature can be the antagonist. Nature preventing the hero or the protagonist from accomplishing his or her goal, solving his or her problem, and settling the conflict. You also want to take a look at how the characters are portrayed. What does the writer of the drama give you in the way of information about the characters? Do they seem like that the characters are real people, or are they kind of flat and wooden and not believable at all? So those are the kinds of things you want to look at in terms of character. Let's move on. As we bring our discussion of drama to a conclusion, the last two things that you would want to think about and write about in your experiencing art assignment, if you were doing it on a drama, are you want to look at the setting. Where does the story take place and how is that presented? And then again, subject matter and theme. And we've already discussed subject matter and theme. So let's go ahead and move on to the last of the three forms of literature, and that is fiction. And by fiction, we mean novels or short stories. Fiction is the last of the three forms of literature to develop historically. What we understand in terms of fiction has really only been around for maybe 300 years or so from a thousands of year perspective of looking at the humanities. The elements of fiction are much like those in drama. The difference, of course, is when you're reading fiction, that is different from having a story enacted and performed right out in front of you. And drama, while it is written, is meant to be performed. So it's what's behind the performance on stage. Fiction is not intended to be performed. It is written to be read and understood by the reader. And so when we're talking about fiction, we're talking about plot, the same kinds of things that we talk about in drama. How does the story progress? How does the action move? What is the conflict involved in the story? Character. How are the characters presented? Are they believable? Are they developed? Are they three-dimensional? Or are they just barely kind of there and you know about them, but you don't get a feel of them as a real person? Where does the story take place? The setting. What are some of the themes in the story? What are some of the ideas that lie below the surface of the story? Justice, love, cruelty, sexuality, any of those kinds of things can be themes in a piece of literature, in a fiction piece. We also talk about in fiction tone, imagery, and symbol. Now, imagery and symbol we've already talked about. Word pictures that are created for a reader that create a larger sense of meaning than what's on the page. Tone has to do with, is the tone of the story heavy and dark and feels weighty, or is it lighter, pleasant, even funny, or odd, strange? Those are harder to express, but they have to do more with the emotional experience of a reader about the story. That's primarily what we mean by tone. Finally, point of view. Every fiction story is told by someone. That person is the narrator. For many pieces of fiction writing, the narrator stays the same from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. But sometimes the narrator changes. The point of view changes. Who's telling the story? That's what we mean by point of view. Is it one of the characters in the story who's telling this? Or is the person telling the story removed from the story, not in the story? Does the person telling the story only know what the characters in the story know? Or does the person telling the story have the ability to talk about the ideas, thoughts, feelings, motivations of different characters? That type of narrator is referred to as an omniscient or all-knowing third-person narrator. So as you're reading fiction, asking yourself the question, what is the perspective? Who is telling the story? What is the point of view that's being represented? So those are the kinds of things that we look at in terms of a fiction piece. Let's move on.